Hello, Odyssey Church, and anyone else who's watching this today. Thank you for taking the time to hear from God's Word. We're in the middle of a series on Ecclesiastes, and we've been looking at what it means to live meaningful lives in God in a world that can often seem so unfair, unpredictable, and just outright meaningless. So last week we looked at what it means to enjoy our lives in God. And today we're going to look at what it means to make bold but wise decisions in God. So before we look at today's text from Ecclesiastes, I just want to tell you a quick story of something I saw at a kids' party a while back. At this party, the weather was really bad, a bit like we've had the last couple of days. The wind was blowing, the rain was bucketing down, but kids will be kids, and they really wanted to play outside. And so they did. They ran around in the mud, and eventually they decided they wanted to swim, even though it was really, really cold. And so the kids started swimming, jumping in the pool, and at this house that the party was being held at, there was a balcony hanging over the pool, about 3 or 4 meters high. And of course, jumping in from the side of the pool is not really enough if there's a balcony hanging over it. So these kids decided, let's jump off the balcony. And the dad, who was the owner of the house, thought that was fine, as long as he supervised it. And so he did, and one at a time, they jumped off, and he stood and he supervised each person jumping. And as each kid jumped, he said to them, "Don't hesitate, just jump. When I count to 3, jump in." And he'd give them a little push after counting to 3. And everything went fine. But as I watched this, I just thought, this is a little bit risky. The surfaces are wet. A kid might just hesitate and jump incorrectly, or he might slip just before jumping and hit his head. There's so much that could go wrong. So why do I tell that story? Well, I think often making decisions in life can feel like jumping off a balcony into a pool, or off a rock jump into the ocean. There are risks attached. There's a lot of things we can't predict. What if the water isn't deep enough? What if we slip and fall and hit our heads just before jumping? There are risks involved in doing that. And I think if you're a parent and you've ever seen your kids, especially young kids, doing things like that, you might feel a bit like I did that day, just a little bit worried that things could go wrong. And sometimes in life, we have to make decisions that have risks attached. And it can feel like jumping into a pool or into the ocean, off a balcony or a rock jump. But that's part of life. Taking risks and making those decisions is part of life, and it's inevitable. We can't avoid it. So the question is, how do we do it in a way that's both wise and bold? That isn't reckless, but that isn't also governed by fear and playing it too safe. So let's look at our text from Ecclesiastes today. It comes from Ecclesiastes 11, verses 1 to 6, which reads from the ESV, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good." So that might have sounded a little bit confusing to you, and you might be thinking, what does that all mean? It just sounded like a riddle, and that's all right. We're going to look at those verses one by one and just try and unpack them a bit so we get a bit more understanding as to what the author is saying here. I just want to highlight a couple of things that come through really clearly. One of them is the phrase, "you do not know." It's repeated 5 times in those 6 verses that I just read. And so this thing of "you do not know," when it comes to making decisions in life, there's a lot of things you can't predict. There's a lot of uncertainty, is something that the author's really emphasizing in these 6 verses. He says that 5 times, "you do not know." But he also gives us ways in which, even though we don't know certain things in life, even though there is a lot of uncertainty when it comes to making decisions, even though there's a lot of risk attached, there's still ways in which we can make decisions that are bold and wise. So let's begin by looking at verse 1, which says, Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Or the NIV says it will return after many days. Commentators are kind of divided on what this verse means. We're going to look at two of the main interpretations of this first verse, which I think both have a lot of value for us. The first is that this is referring to sea trade. Cast your bread upon the waters, sending out bread upon the waters, in the sense of not so much actual bread, but sending out ships for trade, much like King Solomon would. He would send out ships to go and trade, and they would only come back, if they returned at all, after about 3 years with gold and other things that they had acquired from their trade. But it was a risky business sending out your ships. Sea trade often meant that ships would get shipwrecked or sink or whatever it might have happened on the ocean. And so in this verse, the author is encouraging his readers to take that risk, the same risk that's involved in sea trade when you send out your ships and you know that some of them might get shipwrecked, some of them might sink to the bottom of the ocean. That's part of the risk, but others will return, and they will return with profit. And so he says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days, or they will return after many days. So the author here is encouraging his readers to take risks and to be bold in making decisions, even though things could go wrong. The other main interpretation of this verse is that it refers to giving alms to the poor, or giving money to the poor. And that's because in medieval times, send out your bread upon the waters was a phrase used to express giving bread to the oppressed. And so a lot of commentators believe that this is actually referring to giving to the poor, and not so much investments and taking risks in those investments like we previously discussed now. Now you might be thinking, well, which is it? Is it referring to investing and sending out your ships in order to get something in return and taking that risk? Or is it referring to giving alms to the poor? Because those seem quite different. Well, I think, like I said earlier, there's value in both interpretations, and we can learn something from both. On the one hand, the author, like I said already, is encouraging his readers to take risks and to make those decisions that can potentially benefit us, even if there are risks attached. Almost as if he's saying, you can't always play it safe in life. There will be risks involved, and there will be sometimes losses that you will incur. But in certain things in life, those risks need to be taken. And without taking them, we won't benefit anything. Just like in sea trade, you have to send your ships out in order to get something in return. And yes, there are risks involved. Some of them might sink, some of them might get shipwrecked. But the other interpretation of giving alms to the poor, I think we can also take and learn a lot from. And that's because it's something that we see throughout Scripture. For example, 2 scriptures quickly which speak about giving to the poor and how we benefit from it ourselves are Proverbs 22 verse 9, which says, "Those who are generous are blessed, for they share their bread with the poor." And Proverbs 19 verse 17 says, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full." And so this is a biblical theme, and those are just 2 verses off the bat from Proverbs, which speak about giving to the poor and how we actually receive from it. So we'll revisit that second interpretation of verse 1 a little bit later on. But let's move on to verse 2, which reads, "Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth." So here, for the first time, we see that phrase that appears 5 times in these 6 verses. You do not know, or for you know not what disaster may happen. And here, the author is almost contrasting or balancing the advice he's given in verse 1 with the advice he gives in verse 2. In verse 1, he's encouraging his reader to take risks, because without taking risks, there's no reward. But in verse 2, he's encouraging them to do that in a bold but wise way. And so, as the author says, since we don't know what disaster may happen on earth, he's saying, you don't know what might happen next. I think we can all relate to that in this current moment we find ourselves in. We don't know what's going to happen next week. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in the world right now. And we certainly didn't know that this pandemic and the lockdown that the whole world has gone under because of the coronavirus would happen this year. We didn't see this coming. We didn't know. And I feel like it's taught all of us to realize how fragile this world we live in is and how unpredictable it is. And so when the author says, you do not know what disaster may happen on earth, I think we can all nod in agreement with that statement. So what is his advice? He says, well, give a portion to 7 or even to 8. And if we're going according to the first interpretation of verse 1, that it's giving advice, economic advice, in terms of how we should invest and how we should approach our money and investments, well, then that means don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't make an investment where you're banking on everything working out in one place, but actually spread out your options. Put your eggs in different baskets in case some of those investments don't work. So if we're looking at verse 2 in light of the second interpretation of verse 1, where it's talking about giving alms to the poor, then this speaks about how we should do that, how we should give a portion to 7 or even to 8. 7 was a number of perfection, of completeness. And so the author's saying, give completely, but even go further than that, go one above that, go to 8, one up completeness or perfection in your giving. Abound in giving, be generous in giving is something that we see throughout scriptures and that we're encouraged to do in the New Testament. And the next verse might not make sense in light of that, or the next part of verse 2, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. We might think, why would we give so generously if we don't know what disaster might happen next on earth? Surely you would save money. Surely you would ensure that you are safe in case a disaster happens. And I think we have a natural tendency to want to do that. And the author knew that his readers and the culture he was writing to had a desire to have control of what would happen next. And of course, money gives us a sense of having that control. Money gives us a sense of being in control of whatever may come and of our present situation. But instead of hoarding money and saving and making sure that we are fine, the author tells us to do the opposite. He tells us actually to give of our money, even though we don't know what disaster may happen next. In a sense, he's saying, be generous and giving with your life instead of hoarding things, because you don't know what might happen next. You don't know if you have tomorrow. And we're going to look at that idea again of not hoarding and not holding on to possessions, but actually giving, and that being a wise way to live according to the author and according to Jesus. We'll look at that again later when we come back to verse 1 and verse 2. So what the author's not saying is just give everything away and don't worry about your future. But he is saying, don't hoard your possessions and your wealth and hold on to them, trying to secure your future at the expense of giving. But instead, he's saying, give generously to a portion of 7. That's perfection. That's wholeness, completeness, or even to 8. Go further than that. Go further than that is what is required of you, or what would be seen as a generous amount of giving. Be overly generous with your wealth. And we know that we're called to do that as believers because God is generous unto us. And so as an overflow of what God has given us, we can give to others. Does that mean we just neglect saving and we don't worry about our future? No, of course not. But does it mean that we trust God in our future and sometimes we give instead of hoarding things and holding on to them? Yes. So let's take a look at what verse 3 and 4 have to say. Verse 3, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. So in verse 3, the author is saying there are some things that we can bank on, that we can predict to an extent. And we see that in nature. He says, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. That's something we see all the time, something we know. If we see dark, heavy clouds hovering over Hout Bay, we know it's going to rain soon. And weather forecasts are pretty accurate these days. They know that when there's a cold front coming in, which we've had in the past couple of days, they can predict it 4 or 5 days in advance. So if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. We know that will happen. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. The laws of gravity. And so in verse 3, the author of Ecclesiastes is saying, there's certain things in life that we can predict to an extent. There's certain things that we can say, because this happened, this should happen next. The clouds are full, it should rain. A tree fell here, it's going to stay there. But then in verse 4, he balances that perspective by saying this: he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. So in verses 3 and 4, again, the author is encouraging his readers to make decisions that are both wise and bold. Wise in that, just like in nature, you can look at a cloud that's heavy and say it's about to rain, and a tree that's fallen in a certain place, it will stay in that place. There are laws of nature. There's also conditions in life and things in life which we can say, because this happened, this should happen next. And they're conditions that we can wait for in order to make a decision in a wise way. There's circumstances where you just know, I shouldn't make that decision at this time. Whether it's an investment or a relationship, or whatever it might be, maybe it's just not the right time to make that decision. And you know it because you've seen it go wrong in other people's lives, or you just have been advised that it's not a good time to do it. But on the other hand, in verse 4, the author is encouraging his readers to make decisions boldly. He's saying, even though you can read the signs of certain things and you can predict some things and know when to make wise decisions, you can't have perfect conditions, or at least you will rarely ever have perfect conditions where nothing can go wrong. Just like a farmer must wait for good conditions to sow and to reap, he must look at the wind and the clouds. Before he does that, he can't wait until the conditions are perfect before he acts. Otherwise, he'll never act because there aren't perfect conditions. And so he's saying, yes, be wise in your decisions. Read the signs. Wait for good conditions. Wait for good circumstances. Listen to reason. Listen to wisdom. But also there will be some risk. Don't wait for things to be perfect before you take the step, before you make a decision. The farmer who waits for perfect conditions will never act. The person who waits for perfect, riskless conditions before he acts will never do anything. So yes, there's wisdom in how we can go about our decisions. There's things we can look at and say, cool, now is the right time to act. But on the other hand, you're never going to have perfect conditions. So don't wait for those perfect conditions before you make a decision, because if you do, you'll never do anything. So the author of Ecclesiastes keeps on encouraging his readers to act boldly and wisely. Verse 1, he says, take the risk, cast out your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days, or it will return after many days. Take that risk, send out those boats, knowing that some of them may not return, some of them may sink or get shipwrecked, but send them out. You need to take that risk in order to have a chance of getting the reward of what will come back. At the same time, verse 2, give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Spread out your investments. Don't bank on just one thing working. So act boldly, take that risk, but also be wise. And then in verse 3 and 4, as we just saw, he says there's certain things you can predict. Be wise about that. Just like in nature, you can observe certain things and wait for good conditions before acting. Be wise in how you make your decisions, but also don't wait for perfect conditions. Take that risk. Be wise, but be bold. Be bold and wise in your decisions. Just keeps on coming through. Now let's look at verses 5 and 6. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Like I said at the start, that phrase, you do not know, comes through 5 times altogether in these 6 verses, twice in this verse. And the author's basically saying, there's so much that we don't know. There's so much that we can't predict. There's so much uncertainty in our lives. But this verse is actually reassuring, even though it says twice, you do not know. Because it says you do not know how the miracle and the mystery of childbirth happens, of a child being formed in the womb. And that mystery and miracle of a baby being formed in its mother's womb is something that God does. In the Psalms, David says, you knit me together in my mother's womb. God gives us life. And there's a certain kind of mystery and miracle about that moment that we still don't fully understand, even today. So the author's saying, as you do not know how that happens, how the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. So I think it's really important that we look at what it means to make bold and yet wise decisions in God. Otherwise, I think we can resort to what's comfortable for us, according to our past experiences, or maybe our personality, or just what we want to do in that moment. A good example of this is, again, jumping off cliff faces or bridges into water below, and the decision-making process that happens there with different people. I remember 2 stories where the one situation found someone unable to jump off a cliff because they were so scared, and the other one found a person just jumping off without really thinking about the risk attached, and not really considering what might happen when they jumped. The one was at a trout farm. We were there as a family with another family, and they also had 4 kids, and one of the kids was standing at the top of this cliff that we'd all been jumping off into a river below. And it was his turn, and we were all kind of spurring him on and saying, come on, you can do it. We could see he was really scared and he was really nervous, but we gave him a countdown. We thought, this is it, he's going to do it. And again, he wouldn't do it. At one point, he even started stepping off the cliff after we'd counted him down from 10. And as he took a step off the cliff, he decided, nope, I don't actually want to do this. Grabbed a bush behind him with half his foot off the cliff and pulled himself back, almost sliding down the cliff, which of course would have been really dangerous had he fallen, because he would have hit the cliff on the way down and landed in the shallows of the pool below instead of the deeper part, which is a little bit further out from the cliff. The other story is of a mate who did the opposite to that. We were on a road trip up to Betty's Bay, me and 3 other friends, and we crossed a bridge on the way there, which had a river running underneath it. And we thought, this is a perfect opportunity to do a bridge jump. So we parked the car and we jumped out and we put our wetsuits on and we ran to this bridge. And I thought to myself, we should play it safe here. The water might not be deep enough for us to jump into. Let's first check, go down into the water, see how deep it is before we jump off the bridge. But my mate Ben is not quite like me, and he thought, nah, let's just jump off the bridge and we'll find out that way. So next thing I knew, he was doing a backflip off the bridge and filming it while he did so. So in the first case, we have someone who's too scared to jump because they've thought through the consequences and the risks of what it means to jump off that cliff face. And the second, we have someone who's not thought through the risks and just gone and jumped. And both of those were kind of governed by the personalities of the people in the story, or maybe past experiences. But the one lacked boldness and risk, and the other one lacked a bit of wisdom. And in our decisions, when we're jumping into things which can feel like maybe jumping off a cliff into water below, when we're making risky decisions, we're making life decisions, we need both boldness and wisdom in God. When we make bold and wise decisions in God, it's all about trust and faith in Him. Just like those kids at that party were jumping off that balcony. Had they been doing that on their own, it really would have been wise, and it probably would have been a little bit too risky. But because they had a dad there supervising them, saying to them, don't hesitate, just jump when I say so, and then counting them down and giving them a little push to jump off, they trusted that dad. They trusted that he knew what he was doing, and they jumped because they trusted in him. In the same way, when we make decisions according to God, we need to trust his voice. We need to know that we can trust the one who is there with us. Firstly, we need to choose to make those decisions in him. We can't be like a kid who's running up into the balcony unsupervised by any adults and just jumping off, making decisions according to our own means or our own personality, whatever it might be. Actually, we need to say, God, I want to make this decision boldly and wisely according to what you say and what you call me to do. And then we need to trust him. We need to trust when he calls us to do something, and have faith and trust his voice and trust that he is with us when we make the decision. So in conclusion, the author is saying, since we do not know what God will prosper, use every opportunity to work boldly but wisely. Don't just make decisions according to what you think is right. Maybe jumping into decisions rashly, without wisdom, and making bad decisions that way. Or maybe holding back from making any decisions because you're trying to play it safe and waiting too long and making bad decisions by not doing anything at all. Instead, trust in God. Since we do not know, but he does know, let's use every opportunity to work boldly but wisely, and to make decisions guided by him, to make decisions in him. Now that we've looked at Ecclesiastes 1-6 and just unpacked how the author has encouraged his readers to make decisions that are both bold but wise, and to take risks in a world that's filled with uncertainty and unpredictability, I want to look at what Jesus has to say about how we make decisions in faith, with boldness, but also with wisdom, trusting him. So according to Jesus, one of the wisest and boldest things we can do in our decisions around money or treasure here on earth is to not hold on to it, not to put our hope on it and fixate on it, but actually to fix our heart on the treasure we have in heaven. And why is that a wise and bold thing to do? Well, it's wise because in terms of the economic choice, you want to invest in something that's going to last. You wouldn't want to invest in something where you lose money. Well, Jesus is saying, don't invest in things on earth because eventually rust destroys them. The moths will destroy them. Thieves can break in and steal them. There's unpredictability on earth, as we saw. There are things that are uncertain. But something that is certain and secure is your treasure in heaven. Fix your heart on that. Don't fix your heart and your hope on the treasures you have on earth. That is the wise choice to make. That's the wisest economic choice you can make. Making an eternal investment instead of a temporal one. Why would you make an investment with something that's eventually going to fade and be destroyed when you can make an eternal investment for something that will last forever? So that is the wise choice to make in terms of our money, to fix our hearts on heaven. Why is it a bold choice? Why is it something that requires risk? Well, it means that we have to trust in God. It means that we're saying to him, I'm not going to put my hope in my earthly treasure. I'm not going to put my hope in my money for anything. I'm going to put my hope in you, God. I'm going to put my hope and set my heart on the treasure that is in heaven for me. In Luke 12:15-21, Jesus says this. Then he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. So here again, we see an earthly perspective of riches and decisions made around it contrasted with a heavenly perspective. The man in this parable has an earthly perspective. His fields are doing well, and he says to himself, what am I going to do with all this wealth that I have? And he decides to tear down his barns and just build up bigger ones, to store it away and to hoard it for himself, thinking that that will give him life and abundant life for the years to come. We're encouraged by Jesus to have a heavenly perspective. Much like he says, we should store up our treasures in heaven. Here he says, we should be rich towards God, not store up things for ourselves and neglect being rich to God, or store up things for ourselves at the expense of being rich towards God. So how do we do that? How do we be rich towards God and not hoard up things for ourselves? Well, I think it looks like many things, and ultimately it means laying down our lives for God. But one of the ways we can be rich towards God is with our money, is with our giving. And like I mentioned earlier, Proverbs 19 verse 17 says this, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full. Whoever is kind to the poor and gives to the poor lends to the Lord. And so if we want to be rich towards God, that is a part of how we do it. If we want to have a kingdom perspective of wealth, it means not hoarding out our wealth and holding onto it for ourselves and putting our hope in our earthly treasures. It means putting our hope in our heavenly treasure, being rich towards God and being rich towards others in the process. Because loving God and loving others are two on the same thing. They go hand in hand together. When Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment? The top one he had to give two. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. They both went hand in hand. And so if we want to be rich towards God, if we want to have a heaven perspective of money, we need to be rich towards others here, not holding what we have, but giving it away freely, in boldness and in trust of who God is, and wisely. There are wise ways to do it. So to wrap up, in Ecclesiastes 11:1-6, we see the author encourage his readers to make decisions boldly and wisely, knowing that there's uncertainty in the world and certain things are unpredictable, and we can't always make decisions with perfect conditions, knowing that they'll be completely safe. But we can make them with boldness, taking risks, and at the same time by being wise. And then we looked at what it means to make decisions around money with a heavenly perspective, with a kingdom perspective, with Jesus's perspective. It means not holding on to wealth for ourselves, but actually giving it. Being rich towards God, being rich towards others. Putting our hope not in this earthly wealth or our earthly treasures, but in heavenly ones. And storing up for ourselves treasures there. Making eternal investments instead of earthly, temporal ones.